Imagine a battlefield in Europe around the mid-17th century. Smoke clouds from black powder hover low across the ground, the thunder of muskets rolls in waves, and long ranks of pikemen stand shoulder to shoulder, desperately holding back cavalry charges while their comrades reload. Yet, within just a few decades, those imposing walls of pike symbols of infantry dominance, since the days of the Swiss mercenaries and the Spanish tercios, would fade into history. Their replacement? A deceptively simple weapon, the bayonet. More than just a blade attached to a musket, the bayonet represented a revolution in the way wars were fought, changing infantry tactics from the late 1600s through the Napoleonic Wars. This is the story of how the bayonet replaced the system of pike and shot, reshaping battlefields for more than a century. To understand this transformation, we must first revisit the dominance of pike and shot formations. Since the 16th century, European armies relied on a balance between musket-armed infantry and heavily armored pikemen. The musketeers could deliver devastating volleys, but their slow reload time, often 20 to 30 seconds, left them exposed to cavalry charges. Pikemen provided the solution: long shafts of ash wood tipped with steel that could deter even the heaviest cavalry. Historian Geoffrey Parker, in his seminal book, The Military Revolution, Military Innovation and the Rise of the West 1500 to 1800, notes that the tactical marriage between pike and shot was both a compromise and a necessity, ensuring that firepower could exist without being annihilated by horsemen. Without pikes, musketeers would have been swept away. With them, armies could hold ground and advance in coordinated formations. But technology is never static. By the mid-17th century, the flintlock musket began to replace the matchlock. This innovation made muskets faster to reload, more reliable in damp weather, and simpler to operate. Alongside this came the invention of the bayonet, at first a plug bayonet inserted into the barrel of the musket. Although crude, it allowed musketeers to transform into temporary pikemen by fixing a blade directly into their firearm. Historian Charles Oman, in A History of the Art of War in the 16th Century, observes that the bayonet did not merely add a new weapon to the arsenal, but rather dissolved the old distinction between shooter and stabber. The soldier was no longer just a musketeer or a pikeman, he could be both. The earliest plug bayonets, however, had a fatal flaw. Once fixed, the musket could not fire. Imagine a soldier on the battlefield. Once he inserted the blade, he was locked out of shooting, forced to rely entirely on melee combat. This limitation meant that pikes still remained necessary. But as the 17th century drew to a close, innovation struck again. The socket bayonet, designed in France in the 1670s, slid around the barrel instead of into it. This meant that a soldier could keep firing even with his bayonet fixed. In one stroke, the bayonet made pikemen redundant. As historian John Lynn explains in Giant of the Grand Cycle, the French army, 1610 to 1715, the socket bayonet solved the riddle of infantry armament. Musketeer and pikeman merged, and the modern infantryman was born. France, under Louis XIV, became the first major power to adopt the bayonet en masse, phasing out pikemen by the 1690s. The French army's success in the 9 Years' War and the War of Spanish Succession showcased the power of this new infantry system. Other nations soon followed, recognizing that the bayonet not only simplified training and logistics, but also gave armies a terrifying offensive weapon. A mass of bayonet-armed musketeers advancing in line or column presented the same psychological wall of steel as pikes, but with the added power of coordinated volleys of musket fire. By the time of the 18th century, the pike and shot era was over. Armies across Europe had embraced the universal infantryman, armed with a flintlock musket and bayonet. Yet this was not merely a technical change. It was a profound tactical revolution. Battles no longer relied on two distinct arms of infantry working in tandem. Instead, entire formations could deliver volleys, reload, and defend themselves in melee. Military historian Christopher Duffy, in The Military Experience in the Age of Reason, argues that the bayonet embodied the Enlightenment principle of efficiency. One man, one weapon, multiple functions. This efficiency reshaped how wars were fought. Infantry became more flexible, more aggressive, and far less dependent on static formations. Consider the Battle of Blenheim in 1704, where the Duke of Marlborough's Anglo-Dutch forces employed bayonet-armed infantry to smash through French positions. Or the Battle of Culloden in 1746, where British troops used disciplined bayonet charges to crush the Highland clans. Again and again, the bayonet proved its worth not just as a weapon, but as a psychological terror. Soldiers often broke ranks at the mere sight of cold steel advancing steadily toward them. And then came the Napoleonic Wars, where the bayonet reached its zenith. Napoleon himself famously remarked that the moral is to the physical as 3 to 1, and nowhere was this more evident than in bayonet charges. Though musket volleys inflicted most of the casualties on Napoleonic battlefields, the decisive moments were often sealed with the bayonet. Historian David Chandler, in the Campaigns of Napoleon, writes that, while few men were actually run through, the bayonet charge decided battles because no troops wished to face it. The bayonet's power lay less in its killing ability and more in its capacity to shatter enemy morale. The image of endless French columns surging forward, drums beating, bayonets glittering in the sun, became iconic of Napoleonic warfare. By the early 19th century, the bayonet was so central to military doctrine that entire training manuals emphasized its use. The British infantry drill regulations stressed that the final argument of the soldier is the bayonet, while Russian troops under Suvorov drilled endlessly for cold steel combat. Even as firearms improved, officers clung to the bayonet as the ultimate test of courage and discipline. If you're fascinated by how simple weapons transformed history and want to keep uncovering the hidden revolutions that shaped the battlefield, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and share this video with a fellow history enthusiast. Every week, we dive into the strategies, weapons, and empires that forged the modern world, and your support helps keep history alive. Yet the bayonet's reign was not eternal. As the 19th century advanced, the advent of rifled muskets, breech-loading firearms, and eventually repeating rifles began to diminish the bayonet's practical battlefield value. By the American Civil War, bayonet charges still occurred, but rarely caused mass casualties. Historian Patty Griffith, in Battle Tactics of the Civil War, points out that the bayonet, for all its fearsome reputation, accounted for fewer than 1% of battlefield wounds. Firepower had finally outpaced cold steel. But even then, the symbolism of the bayonet endured. Soldiers still fixed bayonets before an assault, not because they expected to use them extensively, but because the gesture embodied aggression, determination, and unity. Looking back, the transition from pike and shot to the bayonet was more than a technological change. It was a cultural one. The bayonet embodied the ideals of early modern and Napoleonic warfare: discipline, courage, and the terrifying blend of fire and steel. It marked the birth of the modern infantryman, a figure that would dominate warfare until the machine guns swept the battlefield centuries later. And so, when we picture the armies of Napoleon marching across Europe, or the redcoats of Britain holding their ground, it is the glint of the bayonet that captures the imagination. From its crude beginnings in the 1650s to its dominance in the Napoleonic Wars, the bayonet was more than just a blade. It was a revolution, the weapon that ended the age of pike and shot and ushered in a new era of infantry warfare. Because in the end, history is not just about inventions, but about how those inventions reshape human courage, fear, and determination on the battlefield. And the bayonet, simple yet profound, did exactly that. The story of the bayonet reminds us that even the smallest innovations can tip the scales of history. The long pikes that once stood like forests on the battlefield gave way to gleaming steel fixed on muskets, transforming the fate of empires. And when the smoke of gunpowder cleared, it was not the pike that remained standing, but the bayonet, a weapon that symbolized the fusion of firepower and cold steel, the triumph of adaptability over tradition, and the relentless march of military evolution. From the fields of Flanders to the plains of Waterloo, the bayonet was not just a tool of war, but a testament to the ever changing nature of combat itself.